things I wanted to empty out on, you know. Star-Crossed Lovers is very special. That's dedicated to my wife.
Barry Gibb gave the world 60 years of music. But for half a century, the story that mattered most was never the one playing out under the stage lights. It was happening quietly at home, with a woman named Linda. For decades, people whispered about her, about what she did behind closed doors, about the rumor that she once forced Barry to choose between the band and his marriage, the drugs, the toilet, the one thing she would never allow inside their house.
I think in my own head, I thought, that's the woman I'm going to spend my life with. She's a very, very special person. She's just so full of love and full of fun, and she has a great sense of humor.
Now, at 79, having buried all three of his brothers, Barry has finally spoken. And what he revealed about Linda is not the scandal anyone expected. Join us as Barry Gibb finally speaks up about the woman who may have saved his life. A restless beginning. Barry Allen Crompton. Gibb was born on the 1st of September, 1946, on the Isle of Man, into a home where stillness was never really an option. His father, Hugh, was a drummer, so rhythm and the unpredictable life of a working musician were part of the furniture from the start. His mother, Barbara, held the household together as the family grew, and Barry had an older sister, and would soon have his famous younger brothers. Even his unusual middle name, Crompton, carried a thread of family pride, tied by legend to the inventor Samuel Crompton. But pride did not mean comfort. Barry's early years were restless and uncertain, the family moving often and never settling for long. By the time they put down roots in Manchester in 1953, school had already become a place he could not stand. He reportedly skipped it for the better part of a year, a small rebellion that hinted at a boy who simply could not sit still. There was something almost prophetic in that restlessness. The constant motion of his childhood taught Barry, very young, that nothing was permanent and that life could turn on a dime. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his days, through fame and through unimaginable loss. But the same energy that made classrooms unbearable was searching for an outlet. And in 1955, it found one. Together with his younger brothers Robin and Maurice, Barry formed a little skiffle group called the Rattlesnakes, copying the stars of the day like Cliff Richard and the Everly Brothers. On the 28th of December, 1957, still just a boy, he stood before a paying audience for the first time at a local cinema. Most children that age are still working out who they are. Barry was already learning how to hold a room. From the back of a truck to the charts. Then, in 1958, everything changed again, and this time the move was enormous. The Gibb family emigrated to Australia, settling in Redcliffe, near Brisbane. Nothing about it was glamorous. This was not the soft beginning of an easy rise. It was years of hustle, pressure, and survival earned one performance at a time. The brothers sang in any venue that would have them, and in one of the most telling images of their early life, they sometimes performed on the back of a flatbed truck at speedway events, singing to crowds who had come for engines and dust, not for music. That kind of setting can crush young performers or forge them. For the Gibb brothers, it forged them. They learned to win over an audience that had no reason to listen, to be tighter, tougher, and more serious than boys their age had any right to be. They also learned the discipline that would later let Barry write several songs in an afternoon, the habit of treating music not as a hobby, but as the family trade. The act that would one day conquer the world was being hammered into shape on those Australian stages. Their persistence paid off in a way that still feels like destiny. In January 1967, as the family sailed back toward Britain to chase a bigger future, word reached them that their song Spicks and Specks had just hit #1 on the Australian charts. They were leaving the country at the very moment it finally embraced them. It was a fitting send-off for a group that had spent nearly a decade earning every inch of ground, and it gave them the nerve to gamble everything on England. Chasing something steady. Even as music began giving Barry direction, his personal life revealed how badly he also craved something solid to hold on to. In 1966, while still remarkably young, he married a woman named Maureen Bates. The wedding took place on the 22nd of August that year, when Barry was only 19 years old, and the couple settled into a home near the famous Abbey Road Studios in London. On the surface, it looked like a minor early footnote, but it said a great deal about where his head was. After a childhood of constant motion, marriage may have felt like a way to finally anchor his life in one place. It did not work out that way. By most accounts, the marriage brought strain rather than peace, and before long, the two had drifted apart. What makes this chapter matter is less the breakup itself than what it exposed about Barry. He was not only chasing fame, he was chasing stability, safety, a life that would stay put. And for a man carrying that much inner restlessness, even love could turn complicated fast. The truth was that a teenager who had spent his whole life moving from country to country had no real model for what a settled home even looked like. The marriage would not be formally dissolved for years, dragging on in the background while his career exploded around him. Looking back, it reads almost like a rehearsal, a first attempt at building the kind of home he did not yet know how to hold together. It was the first sign of a pattern that would define his life: success on the outside, turbulence underneath, and a deep hunger for a home that finally felt secure. The Beatles' mistake. In 1967, the pace of Barry's life suddenly accelerated. The Bee Gees arrived back in England with little more than demo tapes and a stubborn belief in themselves. Those tapes landed at the company built by the Beatles' own manager, Brian Epstein, where an ambitious young Australian named Robert Stigwood heard them and was instantly convinced. He signed the brothers to a 5-year management contract, and the Bee Gees the world would come to know were officially born. With Stigwood behind them, the group added new members and headed into the studio, and what happened next felt almost like a trick of fate. Their song, New York Mining Disaster. 1941 sounded so much like the Beatles that some disc jockeys assumed it was a secret recording the famous band had slipped out under a false name. That confusion handed the Bee Gees instant attention and made them seem far bigger than they were. For a group that had just arrived home with no real safety net, it was a wild and explosive beginning. A single lucky misunderstanding had changed the temperature around them overnight, and suddenly the slow climb felt like a sprint, and they backed it up fast. A string of hits followed in that brooding, soulful, distinctly British style, including To Love Somebody and Massachusetts, which became their first British #1. The boys who had once sung on the back of a truck in Australia were now climbing the charts in the country they had left as children. By 1971, the aching ballad How Can You Mend a Broken Heart had handed them their very first #1 in America, proof they were far more than a one-off novelty mistaken for someone else. The woman across the room, and right in the middle of that explosive rise, Barry met the woman who would define the rest of his life. He crossed paths with Linda Gray in 1967 on the set of the television show Top of the Pops, at the exact moment the Bee Gees were climbing fast, and his fame was growing by the week. The timing matters, because Linda did not meet him as some unknown dreamer hoping to be discovered. She met him just as the world was beginning to turn its eyes toward him, and yet their connection stayed remarkably private, while the band grew louder around them. Linda was no starstruck bystander. She had been crowned Miss Edinburgh, so she already knew how to stand in front of a crowd, carry herself, and command a room. When Barry noticed her, he was not simply seeing a beautiful face, he was meeting someone with a presence of her own. Barry later said they simply looked at each other across the studio, and something happened. Linda remembered him wandering over and asking her out for tea, an opening so ordinary it could only be real, because the biggest love stories so often begin with the smallest moments. One unforgettable story from those early days has the two of them sharing a quiet moment hidden inside a Doctor Who TARDIS prop on the set, a charming and slightly absurd image of a future legend and a beauty queen tucked away in their own little world. Their bond ran so deep that the very next year Barry wrote the Bee Gees' ballad Words for her, a song he would still be serenading Linda with on stage more than 50 years later, reaching down from the lights to take her hand as she reached up for his. Genius built on pressure. As his love life bloomed, Barry's place inside the Bee Gees grew more important than ever. He was not only the face audiences noticed first, he was the engine behind much of the writing. Accounts from the era describe an almost unbelievable songwriting speed, with Barry sometimes turning out several major songs in a single afternoon. In time, he would write or co-write 16 #1 hits on the American charts, and to this day, he shares the record with John Lennon and Paul McCartney for the most consecutive Billboard #1s at 6 in a row. At one astonishing peak, the Bee Gees became the only songwriters ever to hold 5 hits in the American top 10 at the very same time. Numbers like that do not happen by accident, but behind the polished harmonies and the soft pop image, the pace could be punishing. Barry himself has admitted that some songs were created while the brothers were running on amphetamines and alcohol, the stimulants pushing the rhythm faster and faster. As he once put it, looking back on that whole era, there wasn't anybody you knew that wasn't on some form of drugs. It strips the gloss off the story to hear it. Underneath all that elegance sat pressure, exhaustion, and an almost obsessive drive to keep producing. That relentless engine helped turn the Bee Gees into one of the most efficient hit factories in pop history. But it came at a cost the public never saw. The smooth surface everyone admired was being built, song by song, inside a far harsher reality, and the habit forming in those years would become the very thing Linda set herself against. She was watching the machine that made her husband famous, and she could already see what it was quietly doing to him and to the brothers around him who had no one drawing the same hard line at home. What she did about it would become the most whispered-about secret of their entire marriage. People are still arguing about it today. Hold that thought, because we are coming back to it. Collapse and commitment. By 1969, the cracks were showing. The Bee Gees were no longer the united family force they had been. Tension between Barry and Robin grew so severe that Robin walked away to chase a solo path of his own. To the public, the group still looked triumphant, but inside, the balance was breaking. And the timing could hardly have been crueler, because Barry's first marriage was falling apart at the same moment. Outside, fame was still rising. Inside, both his band and his private life were under enormous strain. The brotherhood that had built the Bee Gees' magic was being torn apart by ego, exhaustion, and hurt feelings, which is exactly why their eventual reunion would come to mean so much. This was no small spat. It was a genuine family rupture. Then, with striking speed, Barry made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. His divorce from Maureen was finalized in July 1970, and just 6 weeks later, on the 1st of September, 1970, which happened to be his 24th birthday, he married Linda Gray. That timeline is almost startling. There was no drifting. There was no hesitation. He knew exactly where he wanted his life to go. And that is what makes Linda's role so significant. She did not arrive late, after the chaos had cleared and the storms had passed. She was already there during one of the most unstable stretches of his life, stepping in just as one chapter slammed shut and another swung open. Marrying on his own birthday felt like a man choosing, in the same breath, both a new year of life and the person he wanted to spend it with. The anchor at home. After the wedding, Linda made a choice that defined everything that followed. She stepped away from public life and poured herself into building a stable home, raising the couple's 5 children: Stephen, Ashley, Travis, Michael, and Alexandra. She could easily have chased her own visibility, having already proven she could handle a spotlight. Instead, she chose privacy, structure, and calm. In the loud, unstable, excess-soaked world that surrounded the Bee Gees, that quiet steadiness mattered more than anyone outside the family could see. The industry around them was a place where marriages dissolved almost as fast as they formed, where temptation was constant and limits were rare. Linda built something entirely different inside their own 4 walls. Barry has hinted at just how vital she was during the most dangerous years. He has acknowledged that the group often leaned on pills and drink simply to keep functioning, and he credits Linda with refusing to let that pattern swallow him. One of the most telling details he has shared is that she would not allow drugs to stay in the house. In his own blunt words, anything he brought home would end up down the toilet. That single image transforms her from the familiar picture of a supportive wife into something far more forceful. She made herself a barrier between Barry and the worst of fame, the one person who refused to let their home become part of the wreckage. It would have been so easy for her to look the other way, to accept the excess as the price of the life they led. She never did. The more you study his life, the more it seems this private strength quietly protected him in ways the public never glimpsed, and perhaps in ways that kept him alive. But this is where the rumor and the truth begin to split apart. For decades, people insisted there was more to it. They said Linda gave Barry a single, dramatic ultimatum. One stormy night. One impossible choice. Her or the band. Her or the drugs. Did that night ever really happen? The answer is coming, and it is not what the gossip wanted it to be. The comeback. Nobody expected. For all the early success, the start of the 1970s was not kind to the Bee Gees. After the brothers patched up their differences and reunited, the hits did not come as easily as before. For a few years, the group drifted, foundering both commercially and creatively, unsure of where they belonged in a music world that was changing fast around them. Plenty of groups never survive a slump like that, and the Bee Gees nearly did not either. For a man like Barry, who measured his worth in hit songs, those quiet years must have felt like a kind of exile. But he and his brothers had spent their entire lives learning how to adapt, and they were about to reinvent themselves so completely that it would rewrite music history. The turning point came in 1975 with an album called Main Course, recorded in Miami with the producer Arif Mardin. Pushing their voices into that soaring falsetto register for the first time, the brothers tapped straight into the rising sound of the dance floor. The single jive talkin' shot to #1, and Nights on Broadway followed close behind. It was a stunning act of reinvention. The same group that had made gentle, brooding ballads in the 1960s had transformed into something sleek, rhythmic, and irresistibly modern. Most artists who find one signature sound spend the rest of their careers protecting it. The Bee Gees tore theirs down and built a brand new one from scratch, and it took genuine nerve to do it. They had clawed their way back from near irrelevance through sheer reinvention rather than waiting for the old magic to return. And what came next would dwarf even this comeback. The fever that took over the world. That reinvention set the stage for one of the highest peaks in music history. When Saturday Night Fever arrived, it did not just become a hit film, it turned the brothers into a global phenomenon. The soundtrack reportedly sold at a staggering rate, close to 1 million copies a week at its height. Strangely, the Gibbs did not fully grasp how enormous it had become. Because they thought of it as a soundtrack rather than a proper Bee Gees album, the world did not care about the distinction. To everyone else, this was total domination. Between 1976 and 1979, the brothers reeled off an almost unbroken run of number ones, including You Should Be Dancing, How Deep Is Your Love, Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, Too Much Heaven, and Tragedy. For long stretches of those years, it was nearly impossible to turn on a radio anywhere in America without hearing a song the Gibb brothers had written. Inside that success sat a small but historic decision. At one point, the film team wanted to rename Stayin' Alive to match the movie more directly. Barry refused, and it was no minor quarrel. He understood that Stayin' Alive carried something far bigger than a single film, a sense of struggle, survival, and spirit that would outlive disco entirely. Had he given in, the song might have stayed chained to the movie forever. Instead, it became immortal. The astonishing part is how fast it all came. Barry, Robin, and Morris wrote How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, and More Than a Woman in a single creative burst in Miami, like a storm passing through them. Yet Barry has admitted there was a shadow over that brilliance, confessing that some of those classics were written while the brothers were using amphetamines. What the world heard as effortless was forged inside exhaustion and excess. Years later, Barry summed up the whole dizzying experience in 5 words, telling Rolling Stone it made us all a bit crazy. The truth behind the rumor. So here, at last, is the answer to the question that followed them for 50 years. Was there ever a single dramatic ultimatum? No. There was no stormy night. There was no shouted threat, no suitcase by the door, no moment where Linda made Barry choose between her and the band. The truth, as Barry has told it, is quieter and somehow far more powerful. There was just Linda, refusing to treat the chaos around him as normal. Again and again and again, year after year after year. She never seemed impressed by fame. She behaved like a wife protecting her family. And that constancy is what gave the rumor its ring of truth, even though the big confrontation never actually happened. What Barry actually admitted says more than any tabloid story could. He has explained that drugs brought into the house simply did not survive, that they ended up flushed away. Linda did not wait for disaster and then react. She intervened, over and over, refusing to let his life slide in the direction that had already devastated his brothers. Her power was not loud, it was practical, and it made falling much harder. In one of his most revealing lines, Barry once said that while he had to watch his brothers drift dangerously out of control, he himself was lucky. He knew exactly what made the difference, and he was honest enough to admit he had not stayed safe by accident. So forget the ultimatum. It was never one stormy night. It was 10,000 quiet ones. It was decades of stubborn refusal, repeated so many times that the collapse everyone feared simply never arrived. Think about what that asks of a person. To hold the same line for 50 years, never once deciding it was easier to give in. In an emotional sense, the old rumor was not wrong at all. Linda really did save Barry. She just did it slowly, patiently, and without the dramatic scene that gossip prefers. That was not an ultimatum. That was endurance. When the world turned on them, then came a different kind of pain, and this one played out in public. In 1979, an event known as Disco Demolition Night turned the entire genre into a target almost overnight, and the Bee Gees became the face of a backlash they had not created. In a single evening at a Chicago ballpark, tens of thousands of people gathered to literally blow up disco records, and the mood across America soured with shocking speed. Radio stations began pulling Bee Gees records, some even advertising disco-free programming, and music that had been everywhere suddenly felt unwelcome. A group that had ruled the airwaves was now treated like something to be erased. It was not merely a shift in taste. It felt like a public rejection of everything they had come to represent. Saturday Night Fever had done two opposite things at once. It made Barry a superstar, and it locked him inside disco just as the culture turned against it. That is the cruel twist. John Travolta could slip into new roles and reshape his image, but Barry could not so easily shed the falsetto, the sound, and the look that had made him famous. He has admitted, much later, that watching Travolta move on and thrive while the Bee Gees absorbed the damage from disco's collapse left a lasting mark. It was never a loud, public feud. It was a quiet distance, and in many ways that made the wound cut deeper. When the industry turned cold, the strain at home grew heavier too. History, though, would eventually take Barry's side. In 1997, the same Bee Gees once mocked and erased from the radio were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A full vindication of the music that a single angry night had tried to bury. The hitmaker behind the curtain. When the music world turned its back, Linda's role only grew, but Barry refused to vanish. Fame had brought one kind of pressure, and failure brought another, and he has suggested that some of his hardest years were not the ones spent on stage. They were the years afterward, when the spotlight dimmed and the industry moved on without him. Through that stretch, Linda held the family steady at their home in Miami, while everything outside felt uncertain. Glamour can fill a room with people, but disappointment empties it just as quickly, and the ones who remain are the ones who truly matter. Hard times reveal who stays, and she stayed. Barry survived the backlash by doing the one thing nobody could stop him from doing. He kept writing, and he quietly became one of the most successful behind-the-scenes songwriters in the world. He and his brothers wrote Woman in Love for Barbra Streisand, the biggest hit of her entire career, as part of her album Guilty, which Barry produced and sang on, earning a Grammy along the way. They handed Dionne Warwick her comeback smash Heartbreaker, a song Maurice loved so much he wished they had kept it for themselves. They wrote Islands in the Stream for Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, a track first intended for Marvin Gaye that became one of the most beloved duets ever recorded. They wrote and produced Diana Ross's Chain Reaction, gave Frankie Valli the title song to Grease, and handed Samantha Sang the hit Emotion. It was an astonishing second act. While the public assumed the Bee Gees had faded, Barry was quietly writing the soundtrack of the era under other people's names. He did not sit and wait for affection to return. He used the one gift no backlash could ever take away. Losing his brothers. Then life struck Barry in the most personal way imaginable. His youngest brother, Andy Gibb, died in 1988 at just 30 years old. Andy had been a star in his own right, a teen idol who scored 3 American #1 hits with Barry's help, including I Just Want to Be Your Everything and Shadow Dancing. But his career had cooled, his personal struggles had deepened, And there had even been talk of finally bringing him into the Bee Gees to make it a group of four. Before that could happen, tragedy struck. Andy died on the 10th of March at a hospital in Oxford, England, from inflammation of the heart linked to a viral infection, though years of cocaine use had already weakened his body. Barry had been trying to help him, which made the loss feel even crueler. One memory grew heavier in its wake. The only time all four Gibb brothers ever performed together, on the 10th of July, 1979, at the Oakland Coliseum. No one on that stage could have known it would never happen again. Maurice's death in 2003 brought a different kind of shock. It came suddenly, during emergency surgery for a twisted intestine, when he suffered cardiac arrest at only 53. Barry was there beside him, watching the moment the Bee Gees ceased to exist as a true trio. Then came Robin's death in 2012, a slower agony, as colorectal cancer spread to his liver, and Barry was forced to watch the decline unfold over months. When Robin was gone, Barry became the last surviving brother, left to carry the entire family story alone. He has said that two people helped pull him back from that grief: his wife Linda and his old friend Paul McCartney. Through all of it, Linda never left his side, standing with him through the funerals, the hospital rooms, and the later deaths of his parents as well. His father Hugh had died in 1992, and his mother Barbara lived all the way to 2016, reaching the age of 95 before she passed. Linda watched him lose nearly everyone who had shaped him, and she became the quiet force holding up the one man still standing. The woman who stayed. The decades of devotion seemed to gather into a few unforgettable moments. In 2018, Barry walked out of Buckingham Palace newly knighted and admitted he nearly toppled over from the emotion of it. He dedicated the honor to his late brothers, but the bigger story stood beside him: Linda and their children watching it all. A year earlier, he had taken the legend slot at Glastonbury and publicly dedicated the performance to Linda, a rare and meaningful gesture from a man who had spent his life guarding his private world. The honors kept coming. He had already been made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2002, was named an Honorary Companion of the Order of Australia in 2022, and in December 2023, he was celebrated at the Kennedy Center Honors, one of the highest tributes American culture can give. His beloved Isle of Man even issued a set of stamps honoring his 5 decades in music. In 2021, at 75, Barry released Greenfields, a collection of Bee Gees songs reimagined as country duets, alongside artists like Dolly Parton, Alison Krauss, and Little Big Town. The softer, more haunted feel of those recordings carried real weight, arriving after the deaths of all 3 brothers, at a moment when many expected Barry to fade into silence. Instead, he kept going, and Linda is often credited with encouraging that creative survival. The album was a genuine triumph, even winning a major Americana award in Britain, proof that audiences had never stopped loving him. And most remarkably of all, the story is still being written, with Barry now serving as an executive producer on a Bee Gees biopic directed by Sir Ridley Scott, set to begin filming in late 2025 and carry the family's story to a whole new generation. The real confession. When people finally ask what Linda's great secret was, the honest answer remains the most powerful one. Barry's real confession was never a tabloid bombshell. It was simply that she shielded him from the same self-destruction that consumed so much of the Bee Gees' world. She would not let drugs become ordinary inside their home, drawing a line and holding it for 50 years without ever letting it move. People love stories of explosive fights and dramatic exits. The truth here is quieter, and it lands harder. It was never an ultimatum. It was never one stormy night. It was 50 years of quietly refusing to let him fall. That is not a scandal. That is endurance. In a world built on excess, she became the one person who could tell Barry no and still keep the marriage alive. That may be the most surprising part of Barry Gibb's legacy. Yes, he is the last surviving Bee Gee. Yes, the group sold more than 220 million records around the world. Yet when Barry speaks about what matters most, he does not point to the trophies or the headlines. He points back home. He and Linda celebrated 55 years of marriage in September 2025, having raised 5 children and welcomed 7 grandchildren, all without ever turning their love into a public brand. Barry has explained the secret simply, saying Linda never wanted to be famous. She only ever wanted to be Linda, and crediting laughter, respect, and honesty for holding them together through all of it. In an industry that chews up love and spits it out, that quiet, stubborn loyalty may be the most remarkable record he ever set. So now we want to hear from you. Did you ever believe the rumor that Linda gave Barry a single dramatic ultimatum? Or does the quieter truth move you more? And which Bee Gees song will always mean the most to you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.